I think that often when people say, what are human rights, they think they're something sort of remote from us. They're international things that really don't affect us here in Britain at all. And I feel very strongly that actually human rights isn't about that at all. Human rights is precisely the opposite of that. It's actually about what it means to have dignity because we're a human being. And it's also about what it means to be an individual and at the same time operate within a society.
Morning, everybody. How are things?
Cherie Booth QC is a human rights lawyer and founding member of Matrix Chambers, a group of barristers specialising in civil liberties and human rights litigation. She's passionate about translating human rights values into an understanding of human rights and the law in the UK. Within citizenship, across all key stages, legal and political literacy, knowledge of human rights processes and the law have been cited as particularly difficult to teach. We've brought together a cross-section of teachers who want to develop a fuller understanding of human rights. And through grappling with core concepts, we'll follow them as they develop and implement ideas for the classroom. Elaine and Craig are from St Albans Primary School. Simon and Lee are from Erith Secondary School. This programme will focus on Key Stage 4. Polly and Darren are from Wanstead High School. They'll meet some of the champions of human rights before testing out their knowledge in lessons using Cherie as a legal expert.
I feel very strongly that we have to get over to the children at school and through them, their parents, that actually human rights really are close to home and have meaning to them in their school, in their families and in their community. It's not just a selfish thing. Human rights isn't just about me, me, me. Human rights is actually about how I operate with my rights and my integrity coming up against you with your rights and your integrity, and how do we somehow muddle along together?
We're using this as a mechanism to teach aspects of the curriculum.
Yeah. What aspects? So what is the aspect of the curriculum?
Well, the aspects of the curriculum is the law machine and how laws are actually made and constructed, and how the European Convention on Human Rights is actually placed within our legal framework.
Yeah. And what we're going to do is basically do sort of a worksheet around the European Convention of Human Rights, an introduction to that, a little bit about the Human Rights Act 1998, so they kind of understand how the 1998 Act fits in. And
it's really important that the kids need to understand that it's not that we didn't have human rights before 2000.
It's
we did
just
have
how
human rights.
they could be protected more within.
Yeah. And in fact, you could even say that Britain was the home of human rights, and you go right back to Magna Carta.
The UK's strong tradition of individual liberties and common law history meant British lawyers took the lead in drafting the European Convention on Human Rights, which Britain was one of the first to sign in 1953. But it wasn't directly enforceable in our courts. If you wanted to bring a specific human rights case, you had to go to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. In Key Stage 4, pupils learn about the Human Rights Act of 1998 and how it's incorporated 16 of the European Convention rights into UK law. The Human Rights Act gives a clear legal statement of our basic rights and fundamental freedoms. Since it came into force on the 2nd of October 2000, British citizens can bring a case directly to the UK courts. One of the aims of the Act was to make the process faster and more accessible than the old arrangement. Wanstead High School in Redbridge teaches citizenship with PSHE. Darren Carmichael is the non-specialist leader of PSHCE. Polly Cook is the citizenship specialist in the department. To introduce the Key Stage 4 students to human rights and the law machine, Polly and Darren decided to take the class to Parliament. The Parliamentary Education Unit organise visits to the House of Commons. They explain parliamentary procedure, provide opportunities for the students to get a taste of parliamentary debate, and look at the democratic process and the making of laws. Another key element of the Human Rights Act is that it requires all new legislation to be compatible with convention rights. This is monitored by the Joint Committee on Human Rights, or JCHR. Lord Judd sits on the Joint Committee, and he's come to talk to the Wanstead students to explain how the Human Rights Act works in the UK legislative process.
What is the Joint Committee and what does it do?
The Joint Committee is a committee made up of 6 MPs from the House of Commons and 6 members of the House of Lords. And our job is to look at every bill that is being introduced and decide whether there's something in that bill that worries us in terms of human rights, and we say why, and where that is the case.
Should we always obey a law if we think it breaks a human right?
That's probably one of the toughest questions I've been asked this morning. Yes, I think you should obey by the law. You should abide by the law. One of the things we're saying is that we need the law to ensure fairness for everybody in society. But if we start picking and choosing which bits of the law we're going to observe and which not, then how does the law really do its job of preserving?
Are there any UK laws that you think break human rights?
In our committee, let's take a very hot potato. In our committee, we made observations in our report which said that some of the laws that have been introduced in response to the terrorist situation are beginning to affect human rights adversely. There's an argument.
Who protects our human rights?
Well, if we live in a democracy, ultimately we protect human rights. So if we want a peaceful world, I do suggest to you, and I say it in all humility because you're the people who've got to manage the future, that we have to make our commitment to human rights second to none of our obligations. It has to be right at the forefront of our concern if we want a decent, stable world.
The first 3 bombs went off simultaneously on the underground. 1 hour later, Hussein detonated the 4th device on a number 30 bus in Tavistock Square.
On the day Wanstead visited Westminster, they saw the Home Secretary, John Reid, present the Intelligence and Security Committee report on the London bombings, an event that brought up several human rights issues.
Khan was a well-respected teaching assistant and youth worker. Tanweer, who was just 22, had recently left university.
At Key Stage 4, students learn about the nature of human rights. They know what some of their convention rights are and that they can be upheld in law under the Human Rights Act of 1998. They also understand that most rights are not absolute.
Human rights are not absolute, they're not a trump card. Most of the rights are actually qualified and limited with the responsibilities to others. Even the rights which are not on their face qualified, such as the right to life or the right not to be tortured, have to be seen in their context. The thing about the right to life is that, of course, there is a qualification for that, which was originally, did originally allow the death penalty, for example. And of course there's a whole debate about abortion and the right to life. The right not to be tortured, of course, is still unqualified. But even there, if you look at it, there is a definitional question, because when is something torture and when is it something bad but less than torture? But these are the questions which are always going to come before the court, because where you draw the line, has it been drawn in the right place, is precisely where we lawyers make our money.
Students know that in the UK, serious infringements of human rights are against the law, but do occur. In an attempt to limit infringements, the Human Rights Act requires that all public bodies, essentially Parliament, the courts and local authorities, must ensure that the decisions they make are compatible with convention rights. To help Polly further get to grips with the legal framework for human rights, she meets Miriam Peck, who was involved in the drafting of the Human Rights Act.
The courts themselves are public authorities, so they're required to act in a way which complies with convention rights. And that's quite important because it means that when they're interpreting when they get the sort of the bare words of an Act of Parliament, they're supposed to read into that as much as possible the convention rights, so that the result complies with convention rights. If they feel that is impossible, then they make something that's called a declaration of incompatibility.
Incompatibility,
which is a sort of technical term.
Incompatibility.
Yes, because the courts don't actually have the power to compel the change. They simply make the declaration. It's like putting up a flag. And then it's up to the government what the government does about it.
But a declaration of incompatibility is very rare, isn't it? It doesn't
Quite
happen very
yes.
often.
It's at the tip it's the tip of the iceberg.
Right. So mostly it would affect that the cases were brought to the lower courts and would be kind of sorted out.
Yes. So I think the general hope is that mostly these things won't get to court at all.
Won't even get to court at all. Yes. And I think they're going to maybe understand this if we can put it in a map that they can see. I think that's really useful. Cause
what happens in the Human Rights Act, we have an interesting mechanism, because when the government decided that we were going to bring these rights home, they had a choice. They could have said, as they do, for example, in cases with constitutions like America, that these rights, if the government breached them, the courts can say they've breached them and then say, I'm sorry, we're going to push down that statute. But we decided not to do that because we decided it was still important to preserve parliamentary sovereignty. So the last word always goes back to Parliament.
So, I mean, is there any opportunity for for someone who was taking a case through the courts, if the government said, we're not budging on this, this is our decision, this is the statute, we're putting it through, we're not changing it, can they go any further than...
What they do is what always happened before we had the Human Rights Act, which is, if you've gone through all that process, you could then go to the Strasbourg Court, which is the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and you could take the case there. Now that takes time, but in the end, if they agreed, then they would say that you've broken the European Convention of Human Rights. But the court itself doesn't have any troops that can enforce that, if you like. It's about the pressure of the other member countries of the Council of Europe, and it's about politics and diplomacy, whether or not it would apply. But as I say, the British government has never not
gone against it.
Gone against it.
Understanding human rights is seen as being linked to understanding the democratic process and building knowledge about becoming informed citizens. The citizenship curriculum expects Key Stage 4 pupils to be working towards a comprehensive definition of the term human rights as used in the UK, and will be able to describe how human rights legislation is enforceable in their lives. Darren and Polly have invited Cherie to Wanstead High School to participate in lessons and to explain more of the legal process to their students.
Lovely to see you here.
I'm delighted to be here. Hello.
Nice to see you again.
So basically this is just a setup of you know, how human rights can be protected within the legal process.
Polly has devised a flowchart to consolidate the students' learning from the parliamentary trip.
Right, okay guys. First of all, I'll introduce Ms. Booth, who has come in very kindly to help with today's lesson. But the first thing, just to recap a bit on the legal process. So can everyone turn over their sheets on their table? So what you need to do is you need to read each of the definitions of how the legal process works, and you need to stick down the key words in the gaps.
What do you think? What do you think of this one? I think you went to see these people, or somebody from this committee.
Be something to do with this.
Yeah. Good. Next one. This is an organisation that is a council or a government run, e.g. the health service. Yes, good. And this is the person whose human rights may have not been respected. Who would that be?
Individual.
Yes, good boy. Okay. Yeah, it's too easy for you, this, isn't it? Come on, yeah.
Is that it? Is that right?
Bingo.
Right, some of you, not everyone, has got questions for Ms. Booth about human rights and being a human rights lawyer.
Who decides whether a case is in breach of the Human Rights Act and worthy of taking to court?
Well, to some extent, it's partly a job of the lawyer, because if somebody has a problem, if you're not trained as a lawyer, you might not automatically think, my human rights have been breached. And that's why if you then go to something like a lawyer or Citizens Advice Bureau, they've got the way of analysing it and saying, well, we think actually you have had a wrong done to you, and we'd say that that was a wrong which breached the human rights.
Does it cost a lot of money to hire you as a human rights lawyer? Who pays?
Well, different people pay. I mean, recently I was representing pupils at school, and they didn't have any money to pay me out of their own pocket, and so the state actually paid me to argue their cases. Other times people will pay me out of their own resources. Maybe a company might pay me, or an individual might pay me.
Who decides the verdict in the HR court? The judge, the jury, or...?
Well, it depends which sort of case it is, because in our legal system there are two broad categories of cases. There are the criminal cases and there are the civil cases. In the criminal cases, most of the criminal cases are done in the magistrates' courts, which are 3 lay members, not lawyers at all, but a few cases, about 5% of all criminal cases, will go to the Crown Court. And in the Crown Court, you have the judge and you have the jury, so that's where the jury comes in. But in the civil courts that we also have in our country, and they're all dealt with by a judge alone.
As a top barrister, Cherie has been involved in a number of high-profile cases that have used the framework of the Human Rights Act.
There isn't, if you like, a separate thing which is a human rights case. The whole point about human rights is that it should be going right through everything we're doing. And so you don't necessarily get a discrete human rights point separate from a much wider question of what your wider rights are. I mean, in one sense, every court case we have involves the human right to have a fair trial, which is acknowledging the human right, which is that everyone is innocent until proven guilty.
Is there any conflicts between precedent law and law made by government?
What you need to understand is most of our law comes from precedent.
Yeah.
Because that's just the way it's worked, that the judges has developed what we call our common law on a case-by-case basis.
In line with the European Convention of Human Rights?
Well, they did that long before the European Convention. If you ask where does the rights to fair trial come from, it comes because the judges in the end decided that was the way the trials had to be organised. Then, of course, Parliament got involved and would set up certain rules. So it's a mixture of both.
And the kids are interested in how it applies to them.
Yeah.
Legal abstractions are not are things that they can't really get their head around.
This is our challenge.
Yeah.
The hook has got to be what interests the young people.
In the media, human rights are all too commonly associated with rights for criminals or rights for terrorists. In the search for contemporary examples of infringements of human rights and to discuss ways in which individuals and groups have campaigned to bring about change, teachers often draw on global situations. Charities and pressure groups in particular have played a major role in focusing the international community on global human rights issues, promoting and monitoring the actions of governments and putting pressure on them to act in accordance with human rights principles. But in trying to find more local and contemporary examples of the Human Rights Act in action, Polly and Darren are struggling to find relevant cases.
Do we have, in any of the resources that we have, case studies? Are they more applicable? Can we use them?
I don't know, we'll have to read through these, won't we?
Have a quick scan. Things that involve Z or X versus the UK tends to be children. PC and S versus the UK.
It has been a massive learning curve, to say the least. It's one thing actually giving them information, it's a completely different matter actually trying to get them passionate about human rights.
But that's the same with grown-ups as well.
Same with, yeah, it is. And to case in point myself, I'm a non-specialist in human rights, so teaching it was new vistas every day.
Polly and Darren have chosen to look at one of Cherie's cases which addresses one of the qualified rights, the right to education. In Ali versus the head teacher and governors of Lord Grey School, Ali's rights, Cherie argued, were infringed after he was excluded from school for allegedly setting a fire in a classroom. Article 2 of the first protocol of the Human Rights Act provides that you have the right not to be denied access to the educational system and that you have a right to an effective education.
OK, question. What's the school to blame under the Human Rights Act and why? Well, to blame for what, first of all? What's happened to Ali?
He's not been allowed an education.
Has he been denied an education?
Yeah.
So, what do you think?
Because the school gave him the tuition outside school, so they were replacing his education out of school.
First of all, what about education? Is it enough then for you to say you've got an education, for you to be kept out of school and not be in the classrooms with everyone else and someone just to send you some class sheets to fill in?
It's not like an education that we have.
No, it's different, isn't it?
Yeah, you should have.
So, if he got different education, do you think that makes? Do you think that's sufficient to interfere with your right to education, or is your right to education just as long as you get any education? It doesn't matter what the quality of the education is.
They should just put him back to school.
So not having been back into school, does that mean then he's entitled to compensation for missing out on his schooling?
Might be.
Do you think it makes a difference that Ali's parents couldn't speak any English?
Yeah, I think it does.
I'm hearing people still chatting
in this one.
That's moderately annoying. OK, let's go round group to group to group and let's see what the decisions are that people have made on the 3 questions. Who do you think was actually to blame? Was the school to blame under the Human Rights Act?
No, because they give him chances and they give him tuition.
So who was to blame?
Parents for not turning up.
The parents were to blame. But, as you know, you cannot take parents to court under the Human Rights Act. Who's the only group of people that you can take to court under the Human Rights Act?
Public bodies.
Public bodies. You can only take public bodies.
The point here is, whose responsibility is it to ensure that Ali gets an education? Is it the school where he's registered, who under our laws are obliged to give the pupils in their school an education? Or is it the parents who perhaps can't speak English, who also have an obligation to ensure he goes to school?
It is the school's responsibility, but then it's the parents' responsibility to send their children to school. But then it's the school's responsibility to make sure that the children are coming to school.
So it's a bit of 6 of one and half a dozen of another, isn't it? Yeah. But just because someone else shares a responsibility with you doesn't mean that you escape all responsibility altogether, does it?
I'd like to say thank you very much, and can we have a round of applause?
They need to understand that the right to education, or the right to privacy, or the right to freedom of expression, if you like, all those rights are not absolute.
Qualified rights.
They're all qualified, and therefore those rights can be interfered with, and in fact all the time are interfered with by the state.
So even if you had set the school on fire, surely if human rights are, you know, universal, he would still have been able to take the case to court to say that...
Yeah, but he'd still have a right to an education,
yeah.
but he might not have the right any longer to have an education in the classroom with other children. The school would be within their rights and within the human rights framework for the rights of others to restrict that right. And therefore the question is, how do you determine that? You have to have a fair process to determine that. One of the problems with Ali, in the Ali case, was that it never got through to the process that we'd set up for exclusions.
Ali did not win his case. On the 22nd of March 2006, the Law Lords agreed that the Lord Grey School had unlawfully excluded Ali. However, they overturned an appeal court decision that he had been unlawfully denied his right to education. As Ali had been offered alternative provision, they decided his rights had not been infringed under the European Convention.
One of the subsidiary issues that came up in the Ali case, which is quite interesting, is of course what happens when you do have a child who's committed an offence and you're waiting for a trial. Does that mean that the child should be excluded from school as long as the trial process takes? And if you do that, of course, you could be talking about months and months when a child has not got any education at all. You know, that in itself is a bad thing. Well, if anyone ever asks me about human rights, I say the thing about them is that they're never actually really as black and white as you might think. They're all about degrees, and they're all about what we lawyers call proportionality often, and that's particularly the case in the qualified rights. If you're talking about using the power of the state to restrict people's rights, then the idea of proportionality is you only make the smallest moves away from the people's rights, if you like. And so even though you might have a case where, yes, you've got a right, but yes, there's a countervailing public interest which needs to be set against that right. The question is, have you done the least intrusive way of exercising this public interest? It's very sophisticated.
It's like a utilitarian approach to ensuring that the greatest number have their rights protected.
Yeah. Except that in the end, of course, at the heart of human rights is the individual. And so some of your rights, even if you're the only person who's affected, the fact that you may still be able to defend those rights.
Trying to help students understand some of the greyness involved in balancing rights within the law, Polly has decided to base her lesson on the detention of Mayday protesters in central London in 2001. Several actual cases developed from this incident involving different articles, but at the core of the complaints against the police was Article 5, personal freedom. You have the right not to be deprived of your liberty, arrested or detained, even for a short period. But clearly this is a limited right, which does not apply when the detention is lawful. Decisions as to what makes for lawful detention, however, can be challenged in the courts.
Put yourself in the position of the character that you've got. Think about their role and whose rights are being broken. 8 minutes. Off you go.
The civil rights campaigner that person's rights were broken because they were kind of tortured on that day. And it's inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment because the police didn't have the right to keep them for 7 hours. And the freedom of expression, they should have been given the chance to say that they didn't have anything to do with it.
Not that the policeman's rights were broken. He was just doing his job.
Freedom of expression, do you think that's an absolute right? Like torture, or do you think it's a qualified right? Why do you think it's qualified?
Because some things you can't have. You have the freedom of speech, but not in all things.
Excellent. Can you give me an example?
Schools.
In school, perhaps, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We all have a right within school. We have freedom of expression, but if somebody just started standing up and swearing or being rude or abusive to someone else, then that would be not okay, would it? Because that would be infringing on the other person's human right, wouldn't it? Yeah? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Eloise, what rights do you think the animal rights protester had taken away from them on that day?
I think freedom of thought, conscience and religion. Not necessarily the religion, but because we weren't actually allowed to express ourselves that much.
Okay, good. What other rights?
The freedom of assembly and association.
Sure, okay. You're the policeman that's rounded everyone up. Who would the police say they were protecting? Whose rights?
They were protecting the public's rights.
So whose right do you think is more important? Daniel, why do you think the rest of the public?
Because there's more people in the rest of the public than there were protesters.
What you're saying is then we're all entitled to human rights, but if our human right as an individual infringes on the majority, on the rest of society, then really we need to think about the fact that the rest of society's human rights are more important than necessarily just the individuals. So how do we balance it? And this is what the courts have to do within this country, thanks to the Human Rights Act 1998. Okay? I think what I've done in the past is really focused on international human rights, Guantanamo Bay, things that have been going on in Zimbabwe, because, you know, they're on the news, they're topical, and you think, oh, I'd really like to teach about this because I saw it on the news last night, and this is... But actually, you know, I think, again, students are interested in that, but being able to bring it back down to it's not these people in faraway lands, human rights, who are being abused. It could be yours. I think that does get students fired up and they do become interested in that.
I think if we can, through our lessons, get the kids to realise that human rights are about everybody, and that they're for everybody, then we would really be making a big breakthrough. Right. And we'd be building a much better citizen for our future, that's for sure.
Thanks very much.
All agreed on that, thank you.
Yeah.